record this as well?
Okay, great.
Sure. All right. I'm starting it right now. All right. Well, all right. My recording is anyway. It's taking a minute, but as this gets ready.
Okay. If you still want to connect via Zoom, you can do that. It makes a nice video recording too for you, but that's up to you.
Please visit www.takeacall.com. Status code 500.
Hello?
Yes. Okay, there you go. It sounds like it's...
There I go.
All right.
Wonderful. All right. So I understand you're a member of the American Freedom Party.
Well, I'm not officially a member in that. I've never paid any dues or anything, but I did run for office under the American Freedom Party banner 2015. I'm very good friends with William Johnson, who's the chair of the American Freedom Party.
Sure.
So I guess I don't think they really consider me an official member because I don't pay a dues or anything like that. But I chat with William probably I don't know, at least once a week. You know, he's a friend of mine.
Right. And in your current run, are you running, under the aegis of the American Freedom Party?
No, I'm registered as a Republican, and I'm running as a Republican.
I see. Okay. Let's just get this down. Okay. And how long have you been in any kind of a white movement?
Gosh, I don't know if I would describe it as movement. I hear that term a lot.
Okay.
I would describe it more as a sort of a group conscious awareness, I think, that white people have experienced. And what I mean by that is sort of like one of those things where everybody's looking around society, everybody sees similar things happening, and everyone's afraid to say something about it. That's how I would describe it. I mean, I've never been to any meetings with any organization like the American Freedom Party. I've never been to any meeting with them either. I'm just friends with William, and he supported me when I ran for office. But the views and the concerns that they have, I most definitely share. And we talk a lot about whites becoming the minority, and I take the social scientists at their word. I don't think they have any vested interest in lying. If they're predicting that whites will eventually become the minority, I take them at their word. If something changes in social trends, I'm sure they'll publish another study because that's what university professors love to do. That's how they make their bread. The part that concerns me, though, is we aren't discussing this openly, and we're not trying to create any laws, civil rights laws, put something in place to protect white people. And if you try to do it, you're immediately called racist, and most often by whites, not blacks, not Hispanics. The idea of a law that makes sure a minority white is not discriminated against for being the minority white, I think scares white people so much that they don't want to discuss it. I don't know why you cannot get a whole bunch of white public officials, and for that matter, even members of the Black Caucus, in the same room and say, okay, guys, white people are apparently going to become the minority if the social scientists are correct. So as a minority, whites are going to experience the same sort of discrimination and social bullying that everybody else experienced when they were the minority. Why not learn from history and put some laws in place to protect them? So.
Okay, I have two questions.
Yeah.
One is, aren't white people protected? If there's a law that says you can't discriminate on the basis of race, doesn't that apply if someone discriminates against a white person on the basis of
I would think it would. I would think it would, and I would think it should. but for some reason it doesn't. And that might be an issue, let's say an enforcement issue, if you will. I would imagine there are some cases where someone's been able to prove in a court that someone discriminated against someone else for being white. But in general, if you raise that issue, it's going to be stamped out immediately. It's not going to go anywhere. Now, with all of the open discussion about that sort of thing now, kind of like articles that you're writing and the article that the National Geographic just published about Hazleton, I think it's bringing conscious awareness to the fact that there is a problem. You know, let's say affirmative action. I think affirmative action is indisputably race-based. That was the whole point of it. But in my opinion, I think we're beyond the point in time where affirmative action is beneficial. I think we're now at a point in time where affirmative action is actually discriminatory against white people. You know, I don't think we need affirmative action anymore. And the reason I don't think we need it is because we have a black caucus. We have black congressmen. We have black cabinet members. And that's not at all unusual. We had a black president. I mean, at what point do we say, okay, now we can roll affirmative action back or just get rid of affirmative action altogether, right? So if whites are becoming the minority, wouldn't that mean that affirmative action in some way has done its carried out its intended role, because affirmative action probably played a role in immigration as well. So at what point can we just shut it off? You know, I think affirmative action is racist, but it was intentionally racist.
Sorry, I just want to ask, it sounds like you think it was beneficial at some point in the past, but it no longer is affirmative action?
Oh, I think it most definitely benefits minorities, but I think it's beyond a point where it's actually benefiting society as a whole. Only minorities are benefiting from it. I think it's giving an unfair advantage. I think at this point, black people, Hispanic people have come so far along that it's an unfair advantage to them to have affirmative action. You know, we have black scholars. We had a black president. Why do we still need affirmative action? And if we do keep affirmative action, then what about some sort of affirmative action category for white people who are below a certain socioeconomic threshold? That has been thrown around in the past. President Obama threw that around when he was running for office. He never pushed it through, but he did toss it around on stage a couple times. And
I think I remember this would be called like class-based affirmative action, right? Is that the thing you're thinking of?
It is something I'm thinking of, but I don't know that someone else called it that, so I don't want to say.
Right, sure.
I don't want to say that's what someone else called it, but yes.
Sure. That's interesting.
Here's something else too that I think would help. A friend of mine is a Harvard-educated PhD, lives down in New Orleans, and he graduated undergrad from Tulane. So he goes to a lot of academic symposiums. He's an intellectual-oriented guy, so he's sort of addicted to symposiums like most PhDs are. And he contacted me a couple weeks ago. They had a symposium at Tulane about, I assume it's Tulane, about, I don't know what it was about. It involved politics. I think it was anthropology, because he's an anthropologist. So it was probably about anthropology, but in the context of today's life. But there was an organization from Pennsylvania down there that really pushed the redistricting, and I don't remember its name, but it was Fair Districts Pennsylvania or something like that. And he contacted me and he said, hey, you know, people from Pennsylvania are down here, you know, you should talk to them. And they did a really quick conference call during one of the breaks, like a speakerphone call, and I chatted with him and somebody from that organization. And I said, when you guys are having your next round of your symposium, why don't you throw out the idea of allowing for congressional representation based off of race and with a much broader political boundary, like the sovereign state boundary, the boundary of California, the boundary of Pennsylvania, the boundary of Texas, so that it would go by the number of people who are of that race. So so many white people, whatever threshold we decide, let's say it's 250,000, let's say it's 1 million, for every 1 million white people, then you could get a congressional representative to represent whites. For every 1 million black people, you would get a congressional representative to represent blacks, or maybe it needs to be a smaller number, right? So maybe if blacks are the minority, maybe their threshold number should be a little smaller than the white threshold number. But I said, wouldn't that do away with the redistricting problem? Because the question I asked her, I said, so when they do redistricting in the past, do they draw the line right dead center through a black community? Then you have like, a couple, let's say, tens of thousands of blacks voting in District A and another couple tens of thousands voting in District B, and together they're not enough to sway the vote in either of the two districts. So would it not be beneficial to have it organized by race? So then it wouldn't matter whether they live on this side of the county line or that side of the county line. If you meet the threshold number, I throw out the number 200,000, 250,000. That's probably a low number with today's population count, but whatever the number was, as soon as it got to that point, then they would have a congressional representative regardless of where anyone drew the lines on the map. So just use the 50 sovereign states as the boundary, and then you use race to determine the representation. But of course, the phone just went silent, and I was shocked that the phone went silent. I think she didn't know how to react to that question. But, why not? I mean, if it's a bad idea, you could just say, I think it's a bad idea, and here's why. But I didn't get that. I just got stone cold silence from anthropologists, I would think anthropologists are the people that make the rest of us blush because they're willing to talk about pretty much anything. So, I don't know. So that's an idea I throw out there. I don't think it's going to go anywhere, but I think the discussion about that idea would be beneficial.
Sounds like you're very motivated by, what will happen, what could happen. The question of what it would be like for white people if we were a minority in this country. So can I ask you about that? So
yeah,
needing to put protections in place. What do you think is the threat? What do you think could happen that that would be bad for white people if we become a minority?
I think the same things that have happened in the past to other minorities will happen to whites. So, for example, I'm of Irish descent, so somewhere in my ancestry was likely someone who served in indentured servitude,
right.
Because the Irish were indentured servants. The difference was that the Irish man could eventually work himself out of indentured servitude, pay the bond, and you were a free man, and then you could have the opportunity to perhaps become successful, maybe own your own land one day, etc. And the black man could not until abolition. But whites are going to experience the same discrimination as does any other group when you're the minority. Maybe one way to experience it would be to find a school, for example, where most of the kids growing up are black, and then there's a minority of white kids, and at some point where they become racially conscious, which I imagine is probably happening younger, but I don't know that. But it seems to me with so much access to information, that probably happens at an earlier age. And I think that you're going to see that the white minority kids are going to experience the same sort of discrimination in class and in the hallway and in the lunchroom as a small group of black kids would have experienced in a white school. I think that would be the case. So, I think that there's probably somebody who's done studies on this with other animals than humans, but I tend to think that it's probably something that's just natural. It's going to happen. If there's only 5 women in a room and there's 100 guys, the women are going to experience some sort of discrimination. If there's 5 guys working in a corporation and there's 100 women, then the guys are going to experience some sort of discrimination. I don't think it's going to be any different for white people when white people become the minority. And I think the reason why white people, more so than others, are afraid to talk about it is I think white people are just they're scared to cope. They don't want to accept the fact that this is happening. So white people are just in denial about it. I think that white people are going to have a very, very difficult time when white people become the minority, because we're not the minority yet, and still, if a white person is discriminated against, they have a much harder time raising that issue than would be the case for someone who is not white.
maybe discrimination, hatred, violence, unfair treatment, exploitation, those kinds of things would happen to white people?
Yeah, I think those kinds of things already happen to white people, especially in larger cities where you have a predominantly non-white community. There are all kinds of stuff out there that shows up in social media from time to time where young black people are just either teaching themselves or someone is teaching them just to be very resentful to white people, and it's okay to practice hate and racism against whites. I think that's a terrible thing, and I don't know where it's coming from. I could be coming from moms and dads, but I doubt it. I doubt it. I think it's probably more likely coming from our society and media and music and stuff like that.
Okay. So can I ask, how long have you been concerned about these issues? Kind of worried about this issue, and sort of felt your identity very much as a white person, and that those are the kinds of issues you want to fight for?
Well, I think that you become more aware of being white when you do things like study other cultures. When you go overseas, when you go abroad. I've studied abroad. I forgot Chinese. I can't speak all that much Chinese anymore, and I can't really read it. But I did study up to level 5 of Chinese at Middlebury and at Dickinson. I studied abroad several times. I was stationed abroad when I was in the military. And I think that one thing you notice overseas that you don't notice over here until you come home is that everyone except for whites is willing to consciously look out for their own people. They feel a sense of obligation. And when they abandon that obligation, that they don't have an obligation to look out for other white people, that's their problem. I look out for me, they should look out for them. In other cultures, other than white, very often there's this pressure where someone kind of steps in and says, "Hey, buddy, you have an obligation here, to others," just the social contract, if you will. Black leaders are very open about discussing that. They don't always say the social contract, but that's what they mean. A black congressional leader will come right out, sitting there on the Hill, and he'll say, "Hey, I'm concerned about how this is going to affect black people. I have a duty to provide leadership for black people, and I'm concerned about the black kid who hasn't even been born yet." And they'll hammer people who are, let's say, up for cabinet positions or other people that come before a congressional committee, and they'll hammer them on it, and they'll ask them point blank, will this be bad for black people? And you'll see a white public official sit there, and they'll start to shift around in their chair, and they don't know what to say. And if the answer is no, just say no. If the answer is yeah, just say yeah. But they don't do that. It becomes a tennis match. But you won't see the white congressman sitting next to him say, well, is this going to be good for white people? Is this going to be bad for white people? The white person always feels like he has to say, is it going to be good for all people? Is it going to be bad for all people? But the black congressman will come right out and say, hey, how is this going to affect black kids in a city? And the only thing that these public officials have to say is the truth. Like if it won't, if it's indifferent, if some policy, if some decision-making agenda they have is not going to affect blacks any different than it would affect whites, and it's not going to affect Hispanics or Asians or anyone for that matter, they could just come around and say it. But they rarely do. And I think that is because whites are afraid to discuss race, because whites are afraid to be called racist. And I didn't read all Steve Bannon's speech, but I saw some of the headlines go by, and he apparently said something in France about just embrace being called racist. And if you're a nationalist, I guess this is what must have happened. Somebody said if you're a nationalist, then by definition somebody calls you a racist. And Steve Bannon is saying, so what, get over it. If that's what Steve Bannon's saying, then I agree. So what, get over it. You have an obligation to look out for your people. It's not the job of the Black Caucus to look out for me, right? Their job as the Black Caucus is to make sure the laws are structured in such a way that that next black person coming up through life isn't harmed by that law. And if they decide to accept a certain level of constraint or harm or impediment, it has to be something that they're doing consciously because they think that society as a whole is benefiting in some other way. That is what the Black Caucus does. If this is a worthy sacrifice for the black community, then their job is to say, hey, I think we should accept this. If they think that the black community is going to be treated really poorly by a law, their job is to say, hey, stop, just stop right there. The black people, maybe not of today, but 5 years, 10 years down the road, are not going to be affected well by this law. They're going to be harmed. And they step in and they stand up. They do what a leader should do. But the white leaders, the only thing they seem to care about is themselves, their career, their money. Barletta hasn't done much at all for white people, right? And
I just want to. I have a couple questions. One is, how would you feel if instead of a political leader saying, what are you going to do for white people, or how is this going to affect white people? What if they said, how is this going to affect the working class? How is this going to affect all the people who aren't wealthy?
Some people do that. So I don't have any problem with that.
What do you think about those appeals? Because both white people and people of color are might be in that camp. So sometimes they might have some interest in common.
Well, I agree. You're right. You're absolutely right that white people and black people who fit into other categories where the Venn diagrams intersect have something in common. But race doesn't go away because of that. It's not like race goes. I mean, the wealthy black man has the same tax concern as the wealthy white man. But race doesn't go away because of that. And the working class white guy has the same concerns as the working class black guy and Hispanic guy, etc. But race doesn't go away because of that. I don't see anything wrong with white people having a white community. That's something I don't understand. I don't understand why we had to have the Fair Housing Act. I don't think the Fair Housing Act has been beneficial for society. I think the Fair Housing Act has been detrimental to society. And I think the Fair Housing Act is abused. So why can't we have a white nation? Why can't we have a black nation? Imagine what Africa would be like if Africa was for blacks and Europe was for whites and the United States was for whites and Latin America was for Latin America. There wouldn't be the brain drain that Africa currently experiences. Africa is most definitely in most places underdeveloped. There are pockets of development, but anybody who says, things are just fine in Africa is pretty much lying to themselves, or they don't know what you're talking about. People in Africa live an underdeveloped life. So where are all the smart Africans, the ones who are capable of being engineers and surgeons and leaders of agencies and democratic governments, investment bankers and central bankers? You're not going to find them in Africa. You're going to find them in Europe. You're going to find them in the United States, and you might find them someplace else, because why would they stay? And I'm sure there's the example of the person who stayed or the person who went back. There was a very successful United States Army colonel who was a surgeon who then went back to Haiti. And I remember when Bill Clinton did the Just Because operation to invade Haiti for no apparent reason. That guy, I think, was on the news sometimes, and he went back to Haiti and looked out for Haiti. But if we actually repatriated the black people when they were freed, Africa would be a much more developed country right now, a continent rather. Liberia, for example. I don't see what was wrong with the Liberian colony. I think the Liberian colony was President Monroe's high point. I think that was a great thing that he did when he opened the colony of Liberia. But many Americans have no idea that Liberia was an American colony. They have no clue. They don't know that. And of course it was. And what did we do? We abandoned the colony of Liberia. So how come Liberia is not a developed country? Answer: because the white man abandoned Liberia. The white man had an obligation to Liberia. And if we had kept that obligation, Northwestern Africa would be developed right now. But we would have had to actually repatriate the freed black man, and we didn't want to do that. Nowadays, I frankly think, a lot of people who are asking for reparations for blacks, and I don't mean the United Nations. When the United Nations says that, they're just looking to create a political divide within the United States. If we actually ever paid more reparations than were paid in the past, if we say the 40 acres and the mule wasn't enough and we paid more, and it went through the United Nations, black people would never see that money. It would disappear in the United Nations bureaucracy. But for the United States to come up with some sort of plan, some sort of legislation, or even a constitutional amendment to allow for repatriation to Liberia, to open up the Liberian colony again, and provide funding and provide repatriation money for those who want to go, I think that would be an excellent thing. So,
well, here's a question. So what if Black Americans say, like, no, we consider ourselves Americans. We want to stay here. What if they consider themselves Americans? What would you say to that?
I would say, I would say that's absolutely fine. That decision was settled after the Civil War. That decision was settled with really the 14th Amendment. And I don't think, though, that we owe any more reparations to black people who are descendants of those black people, because that was settled. So what I said, I prefaced what I said with those who are calling for reparations. I think that those who are calling for reparations perhaps should be entitled to some sort of reparation, but with that reparation should come a voluntary renouncement of U.S. citizenship and repatriation to the African continent. And I don't think it should be a minor sum of money. I don't think it should be like, $100. I think it should be a substantial enough money to actually build a life in a country in Africa if someone was willing to go. If we say for example, empty the federal prison system. I don't like federal prisons. I think that we should go. I would like to empty the federal prisons and go back to letting the sovereign states handle that. I think we have way too many laws, and we have way too many people locked up. And I think it's I don't have statistics in front of me, but I think that there are an awful lot of black people in American prisons. And I have to ask, how much of this, and I wish I had a panel of PhD social scientists here, how much of this is because society's behavior has changed, humanity has changed, people have changed, and how much of this is because people are people like they've always been, and the only thing that's moved is the line. We move the line of what's illegal, what's not illegal. We move the line of what a punishment should be and what a punishment should not be.
I'm not sure I understand. So the fact that there are a lot of black people in prison, so what does that have to do with I'm sorry, I'm not understanding what you're saying.
Okay, I'm saying that a large number of those people may be in prison for something that in the past would not have been a crime.
I see.
And in another country may not be a crime right now.
Right.
So why can't we offer people a chance to renounce their citizenship and go to another country that will take them? So let's say, for example, what somebody is in prison for isn't a crime in another country. Okay, and let's say, let's say it is a crime in another country. Let's go with that example too. And let's say they're stuck in the American prison for the rest of their life. Unlike what happens in, for example, there was just a special on about the German prisons where that doesn't happen. They have ways of getting lifers out of prison and back into society. So what if we offered Americans who are in prison for life, or Americans who are in prison, period, the chance to renounce their citizenship and immigrate to another country that will take them, that agrees ahead of time to take them, on the condition that they just don't come back to the United States. And we provide some sort of funding to make that possible. I mean, maybe if we were to empty a federal prison and move a whole bunch of people to a country like Liberia, we would actually infuse the country with people who are educated more than the population there is educated. So maybe someone with a high school education or even part of a high school education here could be seen as not at the upper rungs of the educated portion of society, but maybe in a country like Liberia, they would be among the better educated members of society. So,
and are you also, you're also offering white people in prison the chance to renounce their citizenship and go immigrate to some other country, or it just applies to?
yeah, most definitely,
Okay.
most definitely.
Okay.
But white people can't immigrate to Liberia. That's in their constitution. You have to be black to be a citizen of Liberia, and you'd have to find countries that would take people. So a country like let's say the Netherlands, they would take some people and we would be shocked, but they would not take all. France, may take some people just to kind of thumb their nose up at us, but they would not take all. But the countries most likely to accept people would probably be underdeveloped countries. That's where most people would likely be able to find acceptance out of, let's say, a 20-year prison sentence, a 30-year prison sentence. But if we did that, and I don't mean by tricking other countries, I mean by just saying, hey, would you take 1,000 of our prisoners this year as immigrants, not as prisoners. We don't want you to put them in prison. Would you take them as immigrants, right? If we set up a program, they renounce their U.S. citizenship, and they come over to your country, and they'll be incorporated into your society, and essentially it's like hitting the restart button. So they won't have to serve the full 40 years. They won't have to serve the full 20 years. Maybe they would not be eligible for parole ever, but there would be some sort of parole system where they'd be on parole for 10 years in the new country. I would like to explore something like that. And I know that the Department of Justice would absolutely hate it, because the Department of Justice wants to, lock people up and throw away the key. But I don't think the Department of Justice is right about that.
So I'd like to ask you about religion. I know you've said that I think freedom of religion just applies to Christians. So what about Jews or atheists?
Well, when the Constitution was created, I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever that the Founding Fathers were thinking of Christianity. I think that is what they were thinking of. Now, I know that some of the Founding Fathers were certain that there was an entity, but they weren't sure what that entity was, But in the end, when the whole thing settled, I believe that the First Amendment was referring to Christianity because the Christians had been persecuted in Europe. I think that at that time in our history, the expectation was that all Jews would eventually convert to Christianity, because I'm of the understanding there was a tongue-in-cheek cliche back in the early 1800s where someone would say, "Yeah, when all the Jews convert," as if "Yeah, that'll never happen." So I think that freedom of religion indisputably was intended to apply to Christianity. I don't think it was intended to apply to anything else. However, it is clear that as the nation evolved, people said, well, why shouldn't it apply to this religion? Why shouldn't it apply to that religion? And that argument has had merit up to a point. So at what point do you draw the line and say, okay, but it doesn't apply to anything beyond that? And I think that point is voodoo, satanic worship, and Islam. I don't think Islam is a religion. I think it is a very bad theology. I think it's a terrorist political ideology. Islam seeks to take over the world. That's what it seeks to do. And it has a value system that is contradictory to the value system of whites, and it's also contradictory to the value system of Israel, the Jewish state. So I think that there's a point of alliance there for whites and Jews, in that Islam, for the most part, is bad. It is not good for us. And we could try to rationalize it any way we want, but if the Muslims ever have a chance, they will exterminate the Jews And then after that, they will exterminate the Christians. No matter what they say about can we all get along and we just want to practice our religion peacefully and be left alone, they're liars, right? The Muslim world does not want to practice its religion and be left alone. Now, Israel, I believe, now they'll interfere with politics, they'll interfere with banking, it'll be a competition in commerce, but that's different. They're not coming here to blow up buildings, right? But the Muslim world absolutely wants to exterminate Israel, and who's next? The Christians, right? So then that means the Catholics, that means the Protestants, that means anybody who's not Muslim. If you don't convert, you're Satan and you should be exterminated. So the idea that we would embrace anybody from that faith is unacceptable to me. I don't think Islam should be recognized as a religion in the United States. If we make the argument that all entities have a right to exist, some sort of innate right, let them exercise that right in Saudi Arabia, let them exercise that right in Northeast Africa. That's where the Muslim world is. So practice Islam there. Don't practice it here. I think and Sharia law is something that scares me quite a bit. The idea that there are people in Europe and people in the United States who want to allow Sharia law to have its place is absolutely terrifying. It's absolutely disgusting. Sharia law has no place whatsoever within the boundaries of the United States, and I don't think it has any place in Europe. I'm not going to tell the Europeans what to do, but I don't think it has any place there, and I definitely don't think it has any place in Tel Aviv. So I do not want to extend freedom of religion to satanic worship, to voodoo, or to Islam. And I don't care where that falls or how that sounds. Clearly, we would have to amend the U.S. Constitution for that to be the case. But that's what I'm proposing. I'm not proposing that we go chase people out of a mosque. I'm proposing we just put forth a constitutional amendment, and we either get all the Senate and all the Congress to vote on it unanimously and try to ratify it, or we go to all the states. And I forget what the number of states is that you need. I think it's something like 30 some states, but I don't remember the exact number.
Right. I just want to ask you. You were saying Israel will interfere with commerce, will interfere with banks. Do you mean Jews? You're talking
okay.
What kind of role do you think Jews have in America?
I think that American Jews are loyal to two states, and that is indisputably a problem at some point. You have to be loyal to one or loyal to the other. So at some point, the line has to be drawn in the sand. And as long as we're allies, that'll never come to a point where that decision has to be made. But at some point in the future of the world, Israel and the United States will have its differences, like we had in the past, such as the USS Liberty. I had the privilege of participating in a panel interview with one of the sailors who was aboard the Liberty. And he is still convinced to this day that the Israeli soldiers who were firing on him knew full well that he was an American, and it was not an accident. And I think that the idea that the USS Israel was a false flag attack I think that it's likely to have been the case. I don't think that it was beyond Israel's covert operations at the time. I don't think they would do something like that now, but I don't think it was beyond the scope of things that Israel would have done at the time, because Israel was desperate. Israel was worried about its own survival. And it has every right to worry about its own survival, because I think the Muslim world would, in a heartbeat, eradicate Israel. And I don't think we should ever allow that to happen. And I think we are strong allies with Israel, and we should remain that way, military allies. But I think it is indisputable that the Jewish communities in the United States feel an obligation to Israel. And I think that's a very dangerous thing, because you have to ask, where do your loyalties lie? And an American Jew is fortunate in that you essentially have two governments. You have two nations. So which one are you more loyal to? To me, this is a big national problem. I think the United States was intended to be white, was intended to be Christian, and I think since all Jews are citizens of Israel, they should just be citizens of Israel, not citizens of the United States. But I don't think that means we shouldn't coexist with each other. So I don't think Ruth Bader Ginsburg should be on the Supreme Court. I don't think Jews should be allowed on the Supreme Court. I don't think Hispanics should be allowed on the Supreme Court. And it's ironic because I think, and I'm not certain, I can't remember who wrote, the guy who wrote the Dred Scott decision, if he was Jewish or if he was Catholic. But, you know, I mean, there were Jews involved in the slave trade from the earliest days. I think the Secretary of State for the Confederacy was Jewish. But that was before the information age. The world we live in now is a much smaller world, and it's indisputable that the American Jew has citizenship access to the Jewish state, and they value that, and they should. But to me, it's a conflict of interest, and I just think that national boundaries and racial boundaries should be the same thing. We were once there, and I think when America was great, that's the way it was. The Jews were here, but they didn't have the kind of power that they have now. So I think the Jews have a Jewish state. I think that the Jewish state most definitely is entitled to its say in the world. But I think that the Jews living in America should be overtly viewed as citizens of that Jewish state. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't engage in commerce with them. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't fight alongside of them. I do think that we should. I mean, I served in the first Gulf War, and the mission that my unit was a part of was a special mission out in western Iraq to find the missile launchers that were being used by Saddam Hussein to fire on at Tel Aviv. He was firing Scud missiles. It was a special mission, and it was secret at the time. It's not anymore, but it was back then. Still, though, I really think that we need to get back to the way America was when America was great. Donald Trump keeps saying that. His cabinet keeps saying that. Jeff Sessions keeps saying that. So I asked the question to them, hey, Donald, when was America great? At what era in history do you think America was great? And he, if I understand him correctly, he's referring to the 1950s, and he's referring to the time when America was expanding and when Andrew Jackson was the president. Okay, well, back then, being an American meant being white. If you weren't white, you weren't a full citizen. That did not mean you could not be a free inhabitant. So we did have a situation back then where the whites were citizens, the white males could vote, but not everybody was not free if you weren't white. There were free black men, and there were Jews, there were people here who were not white and who were not Christian, and they lived peaceful, successful lives. But I don't think that the right to vote, the franchise to vote, should be extended to anybody who's not white. But it has been, and given that it has been, we have to honor that. And I think that maybe there's a better way to do it than we're doing, and that's why I say maybe drawing congressional boundaries based off of race, so they're not really geographic. It's a boundary that you know exists, but you can't really draw it on a map. So if there are, whatever the threshold number is that we decide, once you have that many people of a certain race, they get a congressional representative. I think that's a much better way to do it, and then it wouldn't matter who gerrymandered what. I don't know how you could there's probably always a way to gerrymander, but you would not be able to geographically gerrymander that. You could draw your line, of 4 districts straight in the middle of a black community. You could chop it up into 4 tiny little pieces. It wouldn't make a difference, because if cumulatively, if they all live within the same sovereign state of Pennsylvania, and there's 200,000 of them, or whatever the threshold number is, they would have a congressional representative. So the whole gerrymandering thing would be a futile endeavor, and it should be, because right now the gerrymandering initially it helped the Republicans, and it got people like Barletta elected. Okay, great. Now, all right, go ahead.
Sorry. I have to go in a minute, but I just want to ask you, so it sounds like you don't consider Jews to be white.
I don't think Jews consider Jews to be white, because I've seen videos online where like some Jewish kids were singing a song that says, "I'm not white, I'm Jewish." So I don't think Jews consider them. Yeah, I did see that online. Yeah,
I haven't seen that.
If you search around, you'll find it. It was a bunch of kids they were approximately college age, and they were at some sort of retreat-like event, and that's what they were singing. They were the chorus, if you will, line was like, "I'm not white, I'm Jewish," and then somebody would sing a certain part, and then they would say, "I'm not white, I'm Jewish." So yeah, that stuff is out there, and I do not think that Jews for the most part, consider themselves to be white. But there were most definitely white people who converted to Judaism. But no, I think there's definitely a separation there, and I think that Jews have an overwhelmingly powerful control over the media and over the courts, and yet, you know, they're a minority. There's like 5% of the population of the United States or something is Jewish. That's a number I think I saw a couple months ago. I don't know if it's accurate. It could be more, it could be less. But such a small minority of the population has such control over the decisions made in government, and that's because the religion tells them to do that. You know, the religion says, hey, you should establish a system of courts. The problem with that is then you have Jews actively pursuing their religion to establish a system of courts, and then they end up running our courts, and now you see our appellate courts make legislative decisions. And I frankly think that has a lot to do with both the Jewish influence and the socialism, Marxist influence from Hispanic Latinos, because Hispanic Latino culture loves socialism, and you know the Bolsheviks love socialism. So I don't no. So no. I think the Jews are they have a Jewish state. The Jews get to have a state that's allied with a religion. No, it's the Jewish state. Why can't the United States be one of the Christian states? And I think it should be, and I think ultimately it will be. And frankly, I think it once was. You know, the Great White Burden. What was that about? That was about Christianity. The United States saw itself as a Christian state. It's indisputable. It may not have written it down, and now you have like all the monuments that have come down. I think it's absolutely terrible. Like I know several of the people who were involved in combating the takedown of the Civil War monuments around the country, but then you had crosses come down, you had 10 Commandments come down. That wasn't right. A World War I monument coming down, and there are many people who want to take down more World War I monuments. So after the Civil War monuments go around the country, the next is the World War I monuments. I don't want to get rid of World War I monuments. I don't want to get rid of Civil War monuments. I would like to see a federal statute that requires all the monuments that were taken down in New Orleans to put right back up where they were, and all of the other monuments around the country to go back up where they were. And I question how much of that is really black people concerned about how the monuments make them feel, and how much of that is really clever bureaucrats who happen to be black or happen to be liberal who figured out how to make money on society's art. Because you had the mayor in Harrisburg who was making money on all kinds of Civil War artifacts, and he eventually got caught doing it. Well, you know, I think that some of those NGOs that were created to take temporary ownership of the Civil War monuments, like the one in Virginia where they removed the monuments in the middle of the night, and the next morning the community discovers that some NGO led by some black activist manager now had ownership of the monuments and that property. Well, that's prime real estate, right? So now he won't be able to sell the property and sell the monuments and pocket the money directly, but he's in charge of the NGO. So chances are him and his staff of minorities, they're going to pay themselves 6-digit salaries, 7-digit salaries, because their economic development mission is so important. And then they're going to sell off that property, that prime real estate. They're going to eventually sell off those Civil War artifacts, and they won't pocket the cash. The cash will go to the NGO, but they're going to pay themselves a salary for being the NGO worker, and it's going to be at least a 6-digit salary. I mean, you watch, in like 20 years, we're going to start seeing those monuments from New Orleans and Texas and other places, Georgia. They're going to start showing up at Christie's auction or some other auction house. They're going to end up in private collections overseas. That's what's going to happen.
Okay, I gotta go. Just want to ask them, how old are you?
Oh, I like to forget how old I am. But I'm 48.
48, great. All right, thanks, Sean. I appreciate it.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye-bye.